Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to my second floor lair. I'm wearing a necktie from my father, John S. Ray. It has the initials YOG, stand for You Old Goat. It was some social organization he belonged to. Anyway, God bless John S. Ray, my good father. Today's topic is John Adams Part 2. John Adams was the second president of the United States. We stopped last time in 1770. John Adams was a young lawyer, and he was working very hard, very ambitious. He was married to his wife, Abigail. They had a good marriage, and they had 4 children. And he was getting into politics because the American Revolution was getting started, and things were happening. There were acts of violence against the British officials, because of these arbitrary actions and taxes and so forth. And anyway, on March 5th, 1770, the Boston Massacre took place. Now remember, Boston was under military rule. So there were these British soldiers patrolling and protecting British offices. And this incident, it started with one British soldier, and some young men started insulting him. And there was very often drinking was probably involved, and they were yelling at each other, and then a crowd formed, and then the British fellow, the British soldier, he went to get help or he got reinforcements, and then eventually there were 8 British soldiers who were facing an angry mob, a large crowd of Americans, about maybe 200, more than 200, maybe 300, and it was a very ugly situation, and so the soldiers were outnumbered, but they had their muskets on the crowd, and they were. So it was a very bad situation, and the crowd started throwing things at these soldiers. They threw rocks, snowballs, and oyster shells, and then they were taunting them. It's not good to taunt a man who has a gun pointed at you, but that's exactly what they were doing. And one of the crowd said, "Damn you, you sons of bitches, fire!" And then a heavy stick was thrown from the crowd at the soldiers, along with the snowballs, rocks, and oyster shells, and it knocked down one of the soldiers. And then some of the people said, "Kill them!" In other words, kill the soldiers. So these soldiers really felt threatened. And anyway, the soldiers fired on the crowd, and 5 Americans were killed, including an African American, Crispus Attucks. And so, earlier on the situation, the soldier had swung a musket earlier and hit one of the young men. Anyway, this was a bad thing. It was a bad situation, and it became propaganda for the anti-British political forces, those who were opposed to British rule and wanted independence. And then they had there was a trial for these soldiers. The commanding officer was Thomas Preston. Of course, no one really wanted to defend them because the sentiment was anti-British. Now, John Adams ended up defending the British soldiers, and this was one of his great moments of his life and it showed one of the things that I really admire about him is Adams believed in doing the right thing. And in this case, although it was part of American lore from the Revolution, it was part of the propaganda. But the thing is, these British soldiers, it's not just like they decided to kill people, because they were just being cruel and bloodthirsty. Their lives were really threatened. This crowd, they were throwing stuff, and Adams went against public opinion. The public was anti-British, but he thought, no, these men deserve a fair trial. And so he did, and it hurt him politically. It hurt his business, because people thought, "Oh, wait a minute, what are you doing? Why are you supporting the British? What are you, a loyalist? You're not a patriot?" And that's not the reason. He was still against the British occupation. He was against the British abuses, but he felt these men deserved a fair trial, and he was willing to pay the price politically and in terms of his career, losing business and hurting his reputation. And in his closing argument, Adams said this, quote, "Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes and inclinations, or the dictums of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. and he was able to quit the. He was able to get lesser charges or lesser sentence on these men because there were extenuating circumstances, and so he was successful in this trial, and the men were punished, but they received light sentences because their lives were in danger, and so this was a great moment in the. And he was arguing self-defense. This was a great moment in John Adams' life. Like I said, he believed in doing the right thing, and this is wonderful. Even if people think, no, why are you doing that? He had courage. He was a brave man. He defended the British soldiers in the Boston Massacre trial, even though he was supporting independence. In 1771, because of the chaos in Boston, he felt it was dangerous for his family, and he moved them back to Braintree. Now he was writing letters, as I said. He was writing letters supporting his opinions, promoting independence, and protesting British abuses. And many of these were printed in newspapers. In 1772, he wrote this, quote, "The preservation of liberty depends upon the intellectual and moral character of the people. As long as knowledge and virtue are diffused generally among the body of a nation, it is impossible they should be enslaved. Ambition is one of the more ungovernable passions of the human heart. The love of power is insatiable and uncontrollable. There is danger from all men. The only maxim of a free government ought to trust no man to endanger public liberty." I think the important thought there is he talks about virtue. Yeah, the people need to be knowledgeable, but they need to be good people if the country is going to succeed. This was a very strong, I think this is applicable in any time. It needs to be remembered today. If our country is to succeed today in overcoming the challenges we faced, we need to be a good people. In 1773, the Boston Tea Party took place. There was a tax on tea, and the British had removed all the other taxes, actually, except they wanted to show their authority. So they kept this tax on tea, which was resented. And a group of Americans, including Paul Revere and others, dressed up like Indians, boarded this ship in Boston Harbor, and they destroyed three ships. They destroyed the tea. They threw it into the Boston Harbor, ruined the tea, destroyed the tea, and as a protest against the tax on tea by the British. And Adams wrote about the Boston Tea Party, quote, "This destruction of the tea is so bold, so daring, so firm, intrepid, and inflexible, and it must have so important consequences and so lasting that I can't but consider it as an epocha in history." So he was supporting the Boston Tea Party. And the British responded by closing Boston to all shipping until the tea was paid for. Actually, it was never paid for. And this was the point of no return. And they sent a lot more troops to Boston to clamp down on this. They were really punishing Boston for this act of destruction. Adams wrote this, quote, "I knew Great Britain was determined on her system, and that very determination determined me on mine. I had been constant and uniform in opposition to all measures. That the die was now cast. I had passed the Rubicon, swim or sink. Live or die, survive or perish with my country was my unalterable determination." I love his reference to the crossing the Rubicon. That refers to when Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon River in Italy, in the Roman Empire, on his way back to Rome, and he was bringing his army with him in violation of the wishes of the Senate. And this was, and so he was taking a risk, and it actually worked out. Except later he was assassinating. Anyway, that became this expression, crossing the Rubicon, that Adams is using here. That they'd passed the point of no return, that there was going to be war, that this conflict with Great Britain could not be reconciled, that there needed to be a war of independence, and Americans needed to be free to determine their own fate. In 1774, Adams wrote a letter to the Boston Gazette, quote, no, that's not a quote. He argued that Americans had every right to determine their own destiny, and America could face subjugation of the kind inflicted on Ireland Unless America took action and at once, Adams wrote, they faced the prospect of living like the Irish on potatoes and water. This is a very prophetic statement because Ireland was another British colony, and he talks about them living on potatoes and water. How hard it was for the Irish as colonies of Great Britain, colonists. And about 75 years later, the Irish potato famine happened. While the Irish were under Great Britain, while they were a colony of Great Britain, and more than 1 million Irish people died in Ireland in that famine, and so this was their fate as a Adams didn't want that fate for Americans. He wanted them to be able to control their own fate, to decide their destiny, which could only happen if they became an independent country. That same year, Adams wrote this, quote, I have a zeal in my heart for my country and her friends, which I cannot smother or conceal. So the first, as things deteriorated with Great Britain, it was decided among the 13 colonies that they would have a meeting, a gathering in Philadelphia, which was the major city, of representatives, delegates from each colony, and to decide what to do about British abuses. And John Adams was selected as a delegate from Philadelphia. This is the first time he left Massachusetts in his life. It was a big trip for him. And on August 10th, he left Boston and traveled to Philadelphia. The Massachusetts delegation included Thomas Cushing, Robert Payne, and his cousin Sam Adams. It was a 3-week trip to Philadelphia. So this was really this was a big deal, a big meeting. And Adams at the Congress he could tell the delegates were all checking each other out, kind of comparing each other, and he said that they were jealous, fearful, timid, skittish, preening, and had conspicuous eloquence. A lot of guys trying to impress each other with long-winded speeches. And Adams wrote this, quote, I believe if it was moved and seconded that 3 and 2 makes 5, we should be entertained with logic, rhetoric, law, history, politics, and mathematics for 2 whole days. And then we should pass the resolution unanimously in the affirmative. That's kind of funny. He's making fun of these guys who were, talking so much, trying to impress each other. He was also, this was a scary time, because they didn't know if they could win this fight, and he was worried about his career. He had a family to support, and this could really, and actually it was. They really did suffer financially because of his political efforts, and he's taking an anti-British position, and he was worried, and he said, I will not see blockheads whom I have a right to despise elevated above me. And at the Congress, Adams wrote about this. He was writing about the Congress. What plans would be adopted at the Congress if a Sully, now he's making references, historical references to famous people, Sully, a Cecil, a Pitt. Of course, Pitt was this British prime minister who was Pittsburgh's named after. A Demosthenes, that's from ancient Greece, or a Cicero were there, or all of them together. I love these references he makes to history, and it makes you wonder. It makes you want to learn about these people that he was familiar with. Now, one of the things, the main business of the First Continental Congress was to write a declaration of rights and grievances. To say what they believe their rights were and what their grievances were with Great Britain. Put it on paper and have this thing written and sent to the British to let them know exactly what their position were. And Adams was the author of this document. A lot of guys contributed, but he worked on this. He's considered the author of that important document. By February of 1775, Boston was under military rule by General Gage, I believe Thomas Gage. And Gage said this at that time, quote, by the living God, if there is a single man of the king's troops killed in any of their towns, he would burn it to the ground. What fools you are to pretend to resist the power of Great Britain. So now this is right. The war was actually the war broke out in March. The American Revolution, the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, which had been preceded by Paul Revere's midnight ride, warning that the British were coming. And then the following summer, there was by summer there was another meeting in Boston of the Continental Congress, and in that summer, the Battle of Bunker Hill took place in Boston, and while John was in Philadelphia, and it took place not far from John Adams' home. In fact, Abigail and John Quincy, who was 7, they watched the Battle of Bunker Hill from not too far from their home. And remember, that's the Israel Putnam was the was the American general at that battle, and he was actually in Rocky River, Ohio, 1760, about 13 years earlier, on this British mission to intimidate Pontiac and Lake Erie and over Detroit. Now, Abigail was melting pewter spoons in a kettle to make bullets for John Adams' brother Elihu, who was a Minuteman, these citizen soldiers who were ready to fight in a minute, fight the British. And very tragically, Elihu died of dysentery that year. These military camps were very unhealthy. That usually had poor sanitation, and the cooking maybe wasn't very clean, and the drinking water often was dirty. And so John Adams' brother died of dysentery. Actually, my great-great-grandfather in the Civil War, he died of dysentery as well. So it was kind of tough because John was in Philadelphia, and his wife and kids were back near this war scene. So that summer, 1775, it was decided to create a Continental Army, and Adams gave speeches promoting George Washington to be the general to lead that American army. And because, he was impressed by Washington. I think everybody was. Washington was 6'4", big, tall fellow, big, strong guy. He was pretty quiet, and he impressed people with the strength of his character. And so Adams played a role in Washington being named the commanding general, partly because he was from Virginia, and they wanted to, this war started as a Massachusetts rebellion, and they wanted to get support from the South and other parts of the country. That summer, Adams wrote this quote, "I am as fond of reconciliation as any man, but the cancer is too deeply rooted and too far spread to be cured by anything short of cutting it out entirely." Adams again wrote in that summer of 1775, quote, "A government so popular can be supported only by universal knowledge and virtue in the body of the people. It is the duty of all ranks to promote the means of education for the rising generation, as well as true religion, purity of manners, and integrity of life among all orders and degrees." So he's promoting this idea that people need to be knowledgeable. People need to know stuff if we're going to succeed as a country. You need a knowledgeable people, and the people need to be good as well. You need to have good character, and he also mentions true religion. That how can we be good people? Well, through God contacts, since God is a source of goodness, and I think that's true in any time, including today. Now, in that summer, 1775, there was the war had started, but there still had not been a declaration of independence. There was still a hope that that there could be reconciliation, and many of the delegates believed that war with Great Britain, the mightiest power on earth, and actually the most powerful empire in history, this was suicidal. And Adams was, he was promoting independence, that we should break away. This was one of his themes. And he said that during the Reformation, Catholics had the Pope, kings, and emperors, but, quote, "those poor devils, the Protestants, they had nothing on their side but God Almighty." See, he was using history there. So this was his theme in many, many speeches and articles that he wrote, that the war should be fought for American freedom, that it would be won, and that there needed to be state constitutions written by each of the states, because Americans were going to have to rule themselves if they became independent. So anyway, by the fall of 75, you had the standoff in Boston between the American Army in Cambridge and the British Army in Boston. That went on throughout the fall, late fall, and into early 1776. And Adams arrived in February. It was early for the another Continental Congress. Again, he was worried about his wife. They had one of the challenges they had poor information. There was no radio, and there was a lot of bad information. And one of the rumors that came to Abigail was that Adams was dead. He'd been killed. Another one was that he'd been arrested. And neither was true, but, she didn't know that. And there was inflation. The value of money was becoming worthless. So this is a big problem. And there were hard economic times as the war was beginning. So as I mentioned, Adams believed each colony, had to write its own constitution so it could govern itself. And he had many requests to help because, he spent a lot of time thinking about this and studying and writing. And so he wrote a pamphlet called Thoughts on Government, which involved a bicameral legislature, in other words, two bodies in a legislative body, and an independent judiciary. And this pamphlet was used by many of the colonies, who were becoming states now, as they wrote their state constitutions. In March of 1776, the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga had been brought to Boston, and they were put at Dorchester Heights and trained on British forces. And the British band decided to leave Boston. So this worked. This was the great idea of Henry Knox, approached George Washington. Anyway, so Boston was liberated, and they never came back. This was wonderful, that especially for John, that his wife and kids were no longer in a war zone. That the British had enough of Boston. And after they withdrew in the spring of 1776, Abigail wrote this, quote, "That such had come to pass was surely the work of the Lord, and marvelous in our eyes." So a great celebration in Boston, the liberation of Boston, the spring of 1776. In May of 1776, the Continental Congress adopted a resolution calling for each state to write a state constitution. This was another step toward independence. By July, there was a lot of debate about making the break with Great Britain, having a Declaration of Independence written and signed by the delegates. And Adams, this was, as I mentioned earlier, he was giving a lot of speeches and saying that this needed to be done. And he said this, quote, on July 3rd, 1776, "I am well aware of the toil and blood and treasure that it will cost us to maintain this declaration and support and defend these states. Yet through all the gloom, I can see the rays of ravishing light and glory." They knew there would be hard times. This was going to be a tough war. It was just getting started. And it went on for another 7 years. Really tough. And anyway, he was talking about, this is a tough thing to do. Historian James Grant wrote this about John Adams. Quote, "John Adams earned a most comfortable living from his law practice. The war plunged his family into bare subsistence. John Adams' greatness lies only partly in his many contributions to the founding of the American nation. No less extraordinary is the moral achievement of his endurance in its service. His sheer tenacity of spirit is a thing of wonder." Yeah. So they sacrificed. They made a big sacrifice, and like he said, he was doing well financially, and then throughout the war they really struggled, and he was they had the farm which actually Abigail was running while he was gone, because his income as in the Continental Congress and wasn't that great. He was a public servant, wasn't being paid very well. And that summer, Abigail wrote, John and Abigail were writing letters to each other, and Abigail wrote to him, quote, "Remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." See, that's the interesting thing is the Americans were fighting for freedom at that time. And American women could not vote. And it would be 150 years before they did vote. So actually, Abigail Adams was an early feminist arguing for equal rights for women. So they had the final debate on independence in July, early July 1776, and John Adams was the man of the hour. And he gave a very important speech. And Thomas Jefferson wrote that this speech was with a power of thought and expression that moved us from our seats. So this speech is the one where the guy says, okay, I'm going to sign the Declaration of Independence. These various delegates. It was John Adams' forceful speech. Good. He was very good at making arguments. He was very passionate, and he was very knowledgeable, and a strong believer, in our country. He believed in our country, that we could do it. We could win the war. We could rule ourselves. And so this is why the Declaration of Independence was written by Thomas Jefferson and signed. And Adams had promoted Jefferson. He didn't want to. He thought, well, I shouldn't write it because he was too controversial himself, But he thought it was Jefferson. Of course, Jefferson was a good writer. But Thomas Jefferson called Adams, quote, the Colossus of Independence. That these speeches and articles that John Adams wrote really changed opinion, made people believe, yes, it is a good idea. We can beat this mighty empire, and we can win the war and control our own fate, which we needed to do. So July 4th, 1776 is American Independence Day, when the Declaration of Independence was released to the public. And Adams had this to say about it, quote, Independence Day ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this day forward, forevermore. So this was very prophetic. He's talking about, July, the 4th of July. He talks about illuminations. That would be, fireworks, which is such an important part. And of course, it's true. July 4th is a wonderful holiday where we celebrate our country and its freedom, the Declaration of Independence, on July 4th, 1776. Now, that was in July. Now, in August, the British had invaded New York, and the American Army and the British Army clashed, and the American Army was very badly beaten in New York. They performed very poorly, and New York City fell to the British. So yes, Boston had been liberated, but New York City was lost. So this was a tremendous defeat, and the American Army didn't have much experience. The British did, and then they had these German soldiers who were very tough, and very often in the fighting in New York City, American forces panicked and ran. And the army almost disappeared. There was a lot. Then people were thinking, my God, we can't win. We're not going to win. We can't defeat the British. Morale was very, very low. And the army was disappearing because a lot of guys deserted and went home. So these were hard times in the American Revolution. Not long after the Declaration had been signed and released to the public. And Adams responded and he said this, quote, people and nations are forged in the fires of adversity. Yes, this was adversity, but it was a part of the process in our country becoming independent and in the creation of our country. Now, Adams was a very hard worker. He tended to overwork, and there was a lot of stress. He was separated from his family. He was really worried. Of course, he himself, I'm sure he had his doubts about the war. It was a tough thing they were doing, and he was working very long hours. And he had this to say on July 27, 1776. My face has grown pale, weak and inflamed. My nerves tremulous, and my mind is weak as water. Feverish heats by day and sweats by night are returned upon me. So you can see he was having a tough time. He was getting sick, and there was inflation. It was a big problem. It appears we're out of time. Thank you so much for watching. Live long and prosper. May the force be with you. God bless America, the Philippines, and the whole world. See you next time.